What's up, Jason and Jason? Good to see you both this morning. I'm not down. I'm just tired. It's been a long work week. Been a very, very busy week. So, but I'm not like sad or anything. I'm just tired. Yeah, I know, right? I mean, I don't know what to say about it. It's just like, I don't know what to say about it. It's been busy. Hello, good morning, Aaron. What's my dream job? Arnav, I really do enjoy teaching a lot. I don't mind my job. I don't think that I'm a lot happier with my job than I know that a lot of people are with their jobs. And my job is a rewarding job. I feel like I do a good job, and I care about my kids and want them to do well, and I care about setting a good example for kids and stuff like that. So you feel like, I don't know, I feel like I'm proud about my job, and I feel like I have done a good job at my job. But if I could do anything and get paid for it, I guess probably I would produce music full time. That would probably be what I would do. Okay, folks, it is 8:28, so we are, that's right, we are going to get started here talking about the French Revolution. And I gotta wake up so that I can focus here. Okay. So, if we go over to, there's a new, just to let you guys know, there's a new PowerPoint that I uploaded on Canvas for you. So if you want to start following the new PowerPoint, we're now in Unit 3 of World History. Unit 3 is all about the French Revolution. And I'm just going to take a minute to pull this up on my own screen here. French Revolution. Okay, so is this a new camera angle? I don't know, possibly. I don't know. It's probably my stuff on my desk just shifted a little bit, but it's more or less the same. So anyhow, all right, folks. French Revolution. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of different things first. The thing that we finished up talking about when we're learning about the Enlightenment at the end of last unit was how the Enlightenment inspired the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution, we talked about this, right? This was where the United States became upset about having to pay taxes for this war that was fought called the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. And the American Revolution was basically calling out, accusing the British government of tyranny. Okay, they were accusing the British king, George III was his name. They were accusing him of being tyrannical. And the Americans, during the Revolution, did a few different things, like, throw tea into the harbor and stuff like that. And then July 2nd, 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was based on those Enlightenment ideas. And we broke away from British control and established a brand new independent country called the United States of America. Okay? And the United States drafted its own Republican-style constitution. When I say republic, I'm not meaning like referring to the Republican Party. I'm referring to the style of government called a republic, which we learned about. Representative democracy, where people vote for people to go and represent them. But remember that the reason the American Revolution was so revolutionary is because most places on the planet didn't have democratic-style governments at this time, right? Most places on the planet at this time are considered absolute monarchies, meaning that there's no democracy in a lot of places, anywhere really. So the United States is the first time that we see a republic, okay, a democratically run government reemerge since the fall of the Roman Republic, okay, with the death or with the rise of Julius Caesar. So why is that all significant? Why are we talking about this? Because the American Revolution ultimately contributes to the start of the French Revolution. The French are aware of the colonies breaking away from Britain and establishing this brand new kind of government. And they're utilizing all those philosoph ideas that we talked about last unit, ideas from Montesquieu, ideas from Voltaire, ideas from John Locke, and so on. And increasingly, the French are looking at their situation, in particular a certain class of people in France were looking at their situation and kind of asking themselves the question, how come we tolerate a system that's so tyrannical over here? How come we tolerate this system of absolute government with bad leadership? How are we tolerating this? We need to do something to change the system. And so the French go through a revolution. But we need to talk a little bit about how these revolutions, right off the bat, are going to be different from one another. Okay? Keep in mind that when the American colonies broke away, the American colonies were located across the ocean from the British government. which meant that the British government had to wage a war against its own colonies to try to retain control of them, okay? So the American Revolutionary War, we had an advantage because the longer that the war went on, the more difficult and the more expensive it became for England to continue to try to control these colonies that people lived on that were trying to break away from British control. That's going to be easier than the French Revolution. The French Revolution is in many ways, I would argue, messier than the American Revolution. And the reason for that is because the French Revolution is taking place in France, where the king is. Why did Britain want control so bad? Because the colonies were making Britain extraordinarily wealthy. That's the number one reason they had colonies. So that's the only reason places had colonies, is to make the home country rich. And so they didn't want to lose those because they were going to lose all of the money that they were going to make on the colonies. So so the French Revolution happens in France, where the French king is, where the French military is, okay? So this revolution is going to be a little bit messier because it's basically a giant civil war in France. So just so that you're aware, you know, this is going to be a little bit, with the American Revolution, you basically have like a few different parts of the story. You know, you've got the Stamp Act, you've got the Boston Tea Party, you've got the Boston Massacre, and then you've got the Declaration of Independence, the war, and then basically the Americans create a new government called the Articles of Confederation. It doesn't really work out that well. And then a few years later, they changed to the Constitution, and it's been the Constitution ever since. What you're going to realize when we start learning about the French Revolution is it's a little more complicated than that, okay? The French Revolution is there's more steps in it, okay? The French Revolution has this situation where it's like they start off, it goes through like different phases of the revolution, where some of the phases are a little bit more radical and then others of them are less radical, and it lasts for a really long time. Like the French Revolution seemingly just keeps going and going and going and going and entering into new phases. And they, unlike America, where when we break away and we establish our own government, we only have two blueprints for government. The Articles of Confederation was the first one. It failed after like 7 or 8 years, okay? They get rid of that one, and then they enable the Constitution, and we've had the Constitution ever since. Constitution's still in place today, since 1789, okay? Like, or 1787, I think. French Revolution starts in 1789. Within 10 years, they've already had 5 different iterations of government in 10 years, okay? So we've had 2 in like whatever, 200 years, okay, 200 some years. They had 5 within the first 10 years of their revolution. So it's like they're going to go through, they're going to have to keep on dissolving government, going back to the drawing board, coming up with a new form of government, dissolving that one, going back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, there's wars breaking out across Europe. So France is fighting against the British and various others, the Austrians, the Prussians, and so on. The Prussians are the Germans, okay? And then, eventually, the French Revolution results in the rise of Napoleon. Then the Napoleonic era adds another 15 years to the story. So it just seemingly, it starts in 1789, French Revolution, 1789, okay, that's how you can remember the year of the French Revolution, 1789, it's really easy to remember. 1789 is when the French Revolution starts, and then it goes on, and we don't really finish up with Napoleon until all the way up until 1815. So basically we're going to be covering in this unit about 25 years or so of French history, pertaining to the French Revolution, which forever changes the landscape of European politics in Europe. And it has, a lot of implications about the spread of democracy in Europe and the establishment of more democratic styles of government in Europe, which had not been in Europe for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Really thousands of years. So that's why the French Revolution is a pretty cool unit, because it's initiating all of these major changes that are going to make the world start to look more like it looks today to you guys, as opposed to being run by like kings and stuff like that. All right. So that gives you a little bit of an introduction of what we're going to be taking a look at. Now, if you want to open up your PowerPoints, you can, but I'll just switch my screen over here so you guys can see this. And let me move this over here to this side so I can still see the comments. Okay, so to start off setting the stage a little bit here, I better double check so I'm keeping my eye on the clock here. What time do we get done? Period 2, 9:08. Okay. That's good. Gives us a good start. So France in the 1700s. Let's just talk a little bit about France in the 1700s. France, even today, France is considered one of the most advanced countries on the planet. Okay, France is very, very advanced. It's a Western European nation. They're very, very technologically advanced. They have nuclear power and other things like that. All right. France in the 1700s is it's probably the most advanced country of the time, if not one of the most, okay, along with Britain. They have a very large population. The population of France at this time is about 18 million people or so, and that's a pretty huge population. They also have very prosperous trade. The French are making a whole lot of money because the French, like the English, had colonies all over the planet, and they were making money on their colonies. It was also the center of the Enlightenment, okay? The center of the Enlightenment, meaning like when we talk about those guys, Montesquieu, Voltaire, all of those guys were from France. France is really a major, major global power at this time, okay? They have a whole lot going for them, and they have been, really a very, very powerful nation or kingdom, rather, in Europe going on hundreds of years now. And they have this intellectual movement of the Enlightenment where people are increasingly starting to question the role of, society, government in society, the relationship between society and government, okay, people and and their government, looking at law and order, looking at how laws are made, looking at dividing the powers between different branches of government and stuff like that. Okay, that's what the Enlightenment was all about. But France, even though that's where all those Enlightenment ideas originated, France didn't practice any of those ideas. Okay, France was just an absolute monarchy with noble control, like it had been for hundreds of years, going all the way back to the Middle Ages. And so despite their relative success economically and population-wise and stuff, there's a lot of unrest in France because times are changing. By the time that we get to the 1700s, there are some technological advancements, there's some economic and trade advancements that have been happening globally, and the world is beginning to change. And increasingly, as we get towards the late 1700s, we're getting closer and closer and closer to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Now, of course, no one saw it coming. No one knew that it was necessarily coming, but the Industrial Revolution would definitely change everything. And, so what I guess I'm trying to say is that there's been these changes that have been occurring in Europe, and France is kind of still running its country as though it's 200 years earlier. And there has been relatively few changes to the style of French government in a long time by the time we get to the 1700s. And then beyond that, there's some problems brewing with, there's actually kind of like a miniature ice age that happens during the late 1700s in France. where basically there's just terribly cold, unseasonably cold weather for about a decade, and bad harvests, high prices for things like bread, which people rely on to survive. Okay, bad harvests, high prices on bread, high taxes, meaning like people have to pay a lot of money of their taxes. Even if you're really poor, you're still paying a huge amount of the very little money that you're making in taxes. Up to 50% or 60% of your income was paid to taxes. So literally the government was taking half of what people were making. And people were beginning to start to use the Enlightenment to question the authority of the government and the system or the structure of French government in dealing with the needs of the people, who are really, a lot of people are struggling at this time. So the social and political system of France in the 1700s is what we call the old regime, or the ancient regime, as we sometimes call it. Okay, the ancient regime, or the old regime. All right, the old regime in France was based on the old feudal class system. Okay, and what I mean by that is, I think we talked about this before. Back in the olden days, there were all these nobles, okay, that only made up probably 1 to 2% of the population. But there were all these nobles that had huge plots of land, and then they'd have a bunch of peasants living on those lands that didn't have much wealth at all. They were tenants on the land. They were allowed to live there, but they had to pay taxes and other things like that to live there. Kind of like how if you're a tenant in an apartment building and you have to pay rent to your landlord, those ideas were very much, taken from this practice that used to happen in Europe very frequently. Well, the other thing about this system is that the entire society was divided into what they call estates. Think about estates as meaning kind of like social classes, okay? 3 social classes, but these 3 social classes were very uneven, okay? And it kept the population very divided, all right? So there's three estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate, okay? The first estate and the second estate were considered privileged estates. What that meant was they were privileged classes. They had benefits in first and second estate that the third estate members didn't have. Also, the first and second estates combined, okay, together, only make up about 2 to 3% of the total population. Okay, so even though there's 3 estates, 97% of the population of France is in the third estate. The first and second estates only made up about 1 to 3%, or 1% for the first estate, and then like 2 to 3% for the second estate. So a total of about 3%, okay, of the population. And that's not very many. Okay, that's not very many people, but they're the only ones that are allowed to serve in government and have certain privileges like holding office, getting tax breaks, and being seen as generally upper class citizens and getting all of these legal and economic benefits as a result of it. So let's just first talk about the first and second estate. So the first estate was made up of the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church in France. And they own about 10% of the land in France, and they only gave about 2% of their income to the government. Think about that for a second. Remember, I just told you that there's people in the third estate that are paying 50% of their income to the government. The first estate only pays 2% of their income to the government on average, okay? If you're in the first estate, but that only makes up 1% of society. The second estate is made up of what we call the nobility. These are people who had titles that were secular. They might be a duke. Like if we say clergy, we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church members, bishops, archbishops, people like that, cardinals, okay? In the second estate, they have titles like duke, earl, count, things like that. They've got secular landed titles. And the second estate only makes up about 2% of the population. They own 20% of the land. And remember, land at this time is wealth, okay?
and they pay basically nothing in taxes, because the whole reason to become a noble, a member of the second estate, in the first place, is that you don't pay taxes. And a lot of the people in France, by the time that we get to the 1700s, one of the things that you used to be able to do in France that you couldn't do in other places is you could actually, if you managed to save up enough money, you could purchase a title, a noble title for yourself. And you would be called a noble of the robe. And what that meant was that you and your entire family, every future generation of your family, would keep that nobility title, and you and your whole family would never have to pay taxes again. Okay, so this practice had been going on for a long time, which sounds pretty awesome for the people who are able to actually afford to buy a noble of the robe title. But in the long run, it's really bad, because what happened was you have some of the wealthiest people in society not paying any taxes at all, not just for a few years, year after year after year after year, for the rest of however long their family lasts. Generation after generation after generation, they never pay any taxes. And of course, over time, that's like a lot of money not being paid in taxes that could otherwise be used to support the state and take the burden off of the poor people, right? But this is the situation that's developing in France, is that you have these two privileged estates that have a whole lot of wealth. Think about it. 3% of the population of France controlled 30% of the land in France. That's a hugely disproportionate figure. Now, both of these estates scorn the Enlightenment. They don't like the Enlightenment. The reason they don't like the Enlightenment is because, of course, the Enlightenment is challenging them. It's challenging their authority. Okay? The Enlightenment was about taking power from these estates and redistributing that power to certain members of the third estate, the highest upper class members of the third estate, which were not considered upper class in France, but were at least better off than the peasants in France. Okay? So we haven't yet talked about the third estate, but they're coming up next. And the third estate is who supports the Enlightenment. In particular, one segment of the third estate. Now, when we talk about the third estate, you have to understand we're talking about 97% of the population. And not all 97% of these people in the third estate are going to be the same as one another. So we kind of have to break the third estate up a little bit into different segments, okay? The top members of the third estate, the top of the third estate, is known as the bourgeoisie, or the bourgeoisie, okay? These are people who we would in modern day times call middle class folks, okay? Middle class folks. People who are like bankers. When I say factory owners, I don't really mean factory owners in an industrial time. I'm talking, because they don't really have factories, but like, you know, wealthy merchants, people who might own like a store of some sort, or people who have an education. It could be doctors, it could be lawyers, it could be people of that, you know, people who have an education and who are doing quite well for themselves. Okay, these, you know, and some of these people in the bourgeoisie, and by the way, if you've ever heard of that term bougie before, okay, all right, bougie is not just a modern day cultural reference, it's referring to the bourgeois class, okay, the bourgeoisie, bougie, okay, bourgeoisie, middle class, meaning like wealthy. In fact, some of these folks are as wealthy as the nobles are, okay, the nobles who have these fancy titles over in Europe, but they pay way more in taxes because they aren't technically part of the first or second estate. These bourgeoisie members are angry that here they've been very successful, they're educated, they're intelligent, they're capable, okay, and they are kept out of being able to have positions in government, and they're taxed at just a punishingly high rate, okay? So this bourgeoisie class in France was angry that they were being kept back, okay? kept out of government and stuff like that. But that's only really the very, very top of the third estate. I would say percentage-wise of the third estate, the bourgeoisie makes up, I don't know, 5 to 10% of people. Not a very huge amount, okay? Not a very huge amount. The vast majority of people in the third estate are actually at the bottom, peasants, okay? The largest part of the third estate, 80% of the French population is peasants, okay? French peasants, just people who live on the land, small-time farmers. They're kind of just, not particularly educated. They're kind of conservative in terms of their values. They don't want to see a lot of change. They're not radical. The bourgeoisie is more radical. They're the ones who stand to gain the most from the French Revolution. The peasants are probably not going to gain a whole lot from the French Revolution, if we're being honest. Okay, the bourgeoisie is going to gain the most because they're the ones who are the most capable. All right, and then the workers. So there's kind of another segment, and this is the poorest group of people, but they make up maybe about another 10% of the population of France. And they worked in urban areas, and these are going to be people who are basically laborers. They're people who do manual labor. They could be apprentices. They could be servants, like domestic servants. They could be people working in workshops doing like manual type labor, or they could be bricklayers or people like that. Okay, they're going to be kind of your just your average everyday workers, and their lives would have been pretty difficult because they probably wouldn't have been paid a whole lot of money unless they were really, really, really skilled at what they did. So this is kind of your third estate. It's made up of 3 different groups of people: the bourgeoisie, the workers, and the peasants. But the bourgeoisie is the one who's going to be really putting forth the French Revolution because they're the educated ones. They're the ones who are learning about the Enlightenment and using the Enlightenment to challenge the society, the societal structure, right? The makeup of society, and try and make things change. So the third estate, in particular the bourgeoisie, was inspired by the American Revolution, was inspired by the Enlightenment ideals of liberalism, right? Like freedom of speech, religious toleration, okay? Ideas like that. And they start to question the structure of French society. They start to demand equality, liberty, democracy, all right? And because the third estate makes up the vast, overwhelming majority of the people, they think that power should reside with the people. And they use the ideas of the Enlightenment to begin to make political arguments against the King of France and the first and second estate to say, you guys shouldn't be the ones in charge because you don't care about the people. The people care about the people, and that means that the people should be in charge, okay? And the timing of it is pretty appropriate, too, because the timing of it results in a situation that's creating a lot of chaos for France. So I mentioned that they had that little miniature ice age, and the crops were failing. Whenever crops fail, that puts a lot of pressure on the population because there's hunger problems, right? They're hungry. And so the French economy is in decline in the 1780s. They had lost a war with England that I told you about earlier, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. They lost that war in the 1760s, 1763. They lost that war. So they still haven't quite recuperated from that. The bourgeoisie starts to become pretty concerned with the way that the French government is handling all of this because the King of France during this time is a guy by the name of Louis XVI. And he seems not to be handling the problems very well. And the taxes that were imposed by the government on particularly the Third Estate made it impossible for anyone in the Third Estate to make a profit. Meanwhile, the cost of living is going up really fast. So there's these economic troubles that are happening in France where it's like the cost of living is going up, but people are being taxed so much that they're not making enough money to keep up with the cost of living. Not to mention bad weather is causing crops to die. There's a shortage of food that means that there's going to be a lot of people that are starving to death, and the price of food is going up, so people can't afford it anymore. And the French government is going into ridiculous amounts of debt at this time. And so as a result of all of these different factors, all right, we start to see the bourgeoisie, which is, remember, that segment of the third estate at the top, start asking some questions about, like, maybe we should make some changes about how the government works so that, like, people aren't suffering, okay? Now, one of the reasons the French government is going into so much debt is because that guy I mentioned a minute ago, Louis XVI is his name, okay? King Louis XVI and his wife, her name was Marie Antoinette. You've probably heard of these people before, all right? They are extravagant spenders. They live at that Palace of Versailles that I told you guys about a week or two ago. That one with the Baroque architecture, that's where they live. They live in this magnificent palace, okay? But Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette already had debt before they even became king and queen. Previous kings and queens of France had built debt through waging wars that France lost. And so in 1786, the situation with France's debt got so bad that bankers, like Dutch bankers, Swiss bankers, other bankers across Europe, refused to lend the French government any more money because they just keep on not paying it back. Louis XVI was a weak and ineffective king, and rather than being, if you had somebody who was really talented, really savvy, that maybe he would have been able to resolve the problems without having a revolution happen. But Louis XVI is a guy who is a procrastinator. He's not particularly bright. He is out of touch. He is a guy who's not decisive, okay? When you have somebody who's a leader of a country or like a captain of a ship or even, a teacher in a classroom or something, you want somebody who's decisive. Like, this is the decision that we're making and that's final. Like Louis XVI was apt to be influenced by the last person who talked to him. And that's not a good quality for kings or leaders, because that means that they're really influenceable, and your level of trust goes down in them because you never know what decisions they're going to make. All right. So Louis XVI is just considered a weak king. He doesn't solve problems. And then Marie Antoinette, she was Austrian, and the French and the Austrians had kind of a troubled history with one another. And so a lot of French people don't like Marie Antoinette simply because she's considered a foreigner. But she also is an extravagant spender. And because she spends so much money, the French people actually give her this nickname of Madame Deficit, meaning like a budget deficit, meaning you keep spending more money that you don't have. Okay? So here's Louis XVI on the left. Here's Marie Antoinette on the right. And as time goes on, matters worsen in France. Rather than cutting back on spending, Louis XVI waits until France is almost broke. How did the French get out of this debt situation? Well, it took them a very long time, Arnav. Economic problems are kind of like if you've ever seen giant ocean barges, okay? If you have a giant ocean barge that's moving in a certain direction on the ocean, and then it needs to stop and turn around, it's not going to do that very quickly. It's going to take a long time and a lot of energy to change the momentum of that ocean barge. All right, and economies very much work the same way. So the French don't really get out of that debt situation for decades, to be honest with you. Anyhow, Louis waits until France is almost broke, and the way that he decides to go about resolving the problems is he very hastily suggests imposing taxes on the nobility, first and second estate. But the second estate freaks out because the whole reason they're nobles in the first place is because the agreement is nobles don't pay taxes. And so he suggests imposing taxes on the nobles. The second estate is like, heck no, you're not going to tax us. Okay? So they call this meeting called the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. It hadn't been called in a long time. Nakul says, is it better to have debt now, or is it still a bad idea in terms of a country? It kind of depends. It depends. There isn't a single political party on either side, the Democrats or the Republicans, that have done anything but drive up debt for the last 20 years. And so, like Democrats and Republicans love pointing the finger at one another for raising debt, but really they're both complicit in it, even as recent as Trump. It's a good thing to have a balanced budget, okay? It's good to have a balanced budget, but here's the thing about debt. Debt, in some sense, makes it, in terms of a nation, remember that nations aren't people, okay? Nations aren't humans. They're not even animals. They're not living things. Nations don't die, okay? Nations live on generationally. And so because of this factor, think of debt differently, because for an individual, your time is limited. Okay, your time is limited. We don't know how much time as an individual, as a person, we have on Earth. Nations have a lot more time than humans do, presumably. And the idea behind debt and nationdom is that if a nation has debt, you want that nation to stick around, because if they have, in particular, a lot of debt, you want them to be able to pay that debt back. So debt actually operates in some ways as like a nation insurance policy, because it ensures that the nation continues to exist so that nation can continue to pay that back its debts. It would be economically ruinous for the entire planet for the American economy to just blow up and go away. There would be a lot of chain reactions globally to that. And so, for example, China and other places, they don't really want to see the American economy be in shambles, because that means that their own economy is going to suffer as a result of it. And so debt is, I think people panic about debt because it's one of those words that people freak out about, but it's probably, it's not as bad as people make it out to be. I think it's a political stunt in a lot of cases. So anyhow, but folks, that brings us to the end of class, actually. So we will pick it up with the story next time on the French Revolution, and you guys have a fantastic weekend. I'll put up a little vocab assignment for you guys to get started on for next week. All right, have a great day. Just make sure you sign on to Canvas. Attendance will be, sign on to Canvas, and it'll be taken care of. You'll be okay.